I'm here today to talk to you about the ideas of how to create and succeed in a high performance team. I've been thinking a lot about whether to call it create and succeed in a high performance engineering team. And I think, as it turns out, most of the advice here and most of the things that we're going to cover is going to be applicable to a wide range of teams. I'm going to start with a little story. So, a few weeks ago, my manager came into I came to a one-on-one with my manager, and he mentioned, "Hey, Eugene, you know what? Like the majority of connection strengths in my organization, actually all of the connection strengths in my organization are coming from your team." And I thought that was really cool. So let me explain a little bit. As you guys know, I work for Amazon, IMDb, which is an Amazon company, and Amazon internally measures the capability of their teams through an internal polling tool called Connections. And basically what it does is every day it polls all of the members of a team on various things like job satisfaction, manager satisfaction, team culture, productivity, things like that. And employees have a chance to basically comment on how they're feeling in terms of it. And then it generates a report for a manager and going all the way up to leadership chain, basically showing how the individual teams are doing. And so it shows you if your team is in the top 25th percentile, like it's called a connection strength, of all teams in Amazon. And as it turns out, like my team is in the top 25th percentile on every single category. So I thought that was really cool because that's the kind of thing that I really enjoy as a manager. Like I enjoy making my teams an awesome place for people to work. And so I've been thinking about what are the tools and what are the techniques that I use. And then that kind of gave birth to this talk. And this is a talk that I've been developing over a period of a couple of years, actually. What we're talking about here is as managers, like what are things we can do to make our teams more amenable, better places to work. But as employees, the key question here is what are things that we can do as employees, like to instill this kind of team culture that we will be discussing. Some of it is going to be about process. Some of it is going to be about mindset, things like that. But the basic thing that I would like to try to get you guys to take away from this talk is here are a specific set of suggestions as team employees or as managers that you can incorporate into your work environment to be more successful, right? And to make your team a better place to work. So that's the idea. From an agenda perspective, like what you're going to talk about is what do we want from a high performance team? What kind of things do you want to see to know that this team is high performance and to make it into high performance? And then tools, right? How do we get it? Like, how do we get those things? And then finally, we also talk about like mindset, like as a manager, what sort of mindset should we adopt? Or as an employee, what sort of mindset should we try to encourage in our managers to make that happen? The first obvious question is, what is a high performance team, right? What makes for a high performance team? I've put some thoughts on here, right? I would posit that the first thing is going to be timely deliveries. And I'm talking about here, like more from a perspective of if you are a leader of a company, like a senior leader, and you're looking at different teams within a company, how do you determine whether this particular team is high performance and that one is not? So it's going to be timely deliveries. This is a team that delivers what they need to deliver on time. Second thing is with quality, right? So they deliver the stuff that they've signed up for, and you don't have to go back and redo it later. Third one is high scope innovation. So what I mean by that is this is a team that does new things, right? This is a team that has ownership over the business problem that they are given, right? And actively engages to push that business problem forward. And then final thing is obviously low attrition. This is a team that people don't want to leave, right? A team that is constantly in churn is not going to be able to be high performance, right? Because it's constantly losing people, obviously, right? So when thinking about this, let's first talk about as a team as a whole, what attributes do we want to encourage? And then we'll talk about how do we do it. So first one and the most obvious one is predictability, right? We want a team to be able to estimate when they're going to get things done and then do them. Next thing, and this is also important, is work-life balance, right? So we want a team where people are not constantly death marching. I'll tell you a story, like back in Microsoft, the most horrid case of death marching that I had heard was developers that were working on Halo 2. Microsoft wound up having to rent them apartments across the campus because they were literally in no condition to drive home. They were working such hours that they physically could not drive home. That's the kind of thing that we probably want to avoid, right? That doesn't make for good retention. And then finally, like, it's a team that doesn't constantly start things and leaves them unfinished. So in other words, it's a team that when they pick up a piece of work, they finish that work and then they move on to the next work. That kind of speaks back to predictability, right? If a team is going to start a particular thing, they're going to do everything they can to finish it. Next thing is flexibility, right? So basically, how does a team deal with priority changes, right? Like, we know that change is constant, especially in engineering, right? New requirements come in, market changes, leadership decides to do a 180-degree pivot, things like that. How does the team absorb that? Right? Can the team absorb that without randomizing, without huge churn, without attrition? Does the team process allow them to do this? The other thing too is we know that individual contributors tend to like variety in their work. They don't want to be locked into one tiny little thing. Like, I'm thinking of The Office and like that dude who was going to set the building on fire, just sitting there with his stapler and just stapling things. That's not who we want to be. We want to work on new things. We want to learn new things. We want to grow, right? And so a team has to have the flexibility to allow for that to be successful. Third thing is collaboration, right? So it's a team that basically has each other's backs, right? It's a team where everybody, to use George's phrase from a different conversation, it's a team that kind of feels like a small family, in the sense that if you're in trouble or if something is going on, like, they're not going to attack you. They're going to actually help support you. And you feel that support. I had a story. I actually had an internal transfer a couple of years ago from another team at Microsoft. Another team at Amazon. And when he came in, like, I was having my initial conversation with him and he said, "Is it okay if I ask questions?" And I'm like, what do you mean? On my last team, I was told not to ask questions. I was told that if I don't know something, I just need to go figure it out. And that is such anathema, right? That is such anathema to a successful team. So obviously I told him, "No, you know what? Ask as many questions as you want. Please don't hesitate." And the last thing is social glue, right? So this is about, does the team spend any time together outside of straight office environment? That can be team events, that can be going to lunches together, like things like that. But basically, do they have any kind of a social life together outside of work? Why is that important? Because eventually, like, sooner or later, when there is a fire and the team has to really settle in and address that fire, it's going to be like that social glue is what's going to make it possible for the team to get through the fire without like undue conflict and without disrupting relationships, right? Because anytime there is pressure, relationships is going to be the first thing that suffers. So if you have good relationships established beforehand, the team is going to be much more amenable. And then the next thing is efficiency. I've talked a lot about team culture and how important it is for the team to be supportive and all of that stuff. And it is super important. But ultimately, from a senior leadership perspective, if a team has really good connection scores but doesn't deliver anything, not a very high performance team, right? And a very easy way to make that happen is just not to place any pressure on the team whatsoever, right? Just say, "Hey guys, if you want to come in for an hour and do some work, great. But otherwise, just do whatever." The team will be very happy for at least some time, but they just won't deliver anything. It is important to make sure that the team is sustainable, but fast, so that it's delivering things. And you do that by measuring team velocity. And we'll discuss that a little bit more later as we get to that. The next thing is a culture of fail fast, right? So that is basically being okay to be wrong, being okay to fail, right? Having good feedback mechanisms for when that happens. And obviously having the psychological safety on the team to make sure that if failures occur, the team members are not afraid of them and they're not trying to hide them, right? For example, on Amazon, there is a process called the COE, correction of error. When there is a big ticket incident with any of our processes, sometimes the shopping site goes down, or in IMDb's case, sometimes an IMDb page is inaccessible, or like I'm the SDM of the ads org, sometimes ads are not being served. Like all of those are revenue loss situations, right? Like super high pressure situations. And what happens is when the situation is resolved, there is a request for a COE, basically write up a correction of error document. The important thing is that those correction of error documents are never targeted at individuals, right? In fact, like there is a explicit guidance not to mention individual people by name, right? The purpose of a COE and the purpose of analyzing the failure is to make sure the failure doesn't happen again. It's not to punish people. And so that's really important to set up in the team as a part of team culture, that failures are not punished. Failures are investigated and mechanisms are put in place to prevent them from happening again. But it's not about blame. It's not about punishment. So those are the team attributes. So the next logical question is, how do we get it? The answer for the team case is basically a couple process suggestions. And you guys are going to say, oh God, no, this is going to be one of those process talks. Like he's going to bore us with Agile. No, we're not going to go too far into Agile. I'll just cover a couple important things. So first, most important thing is about stack ranking, right? And stack ranking is basically taking the team's incoming priorities and literally putting them on a stack. So that which one is the most important, which one is the next most important, and the next, and so on and so forth. The important thing here is there is no such thing as equally important. And this is something you hear from PMs all the time. Like this feature is important, but that feature is equally important. No, one of them is more important than the other. And as team members and as managers, we do need to hold PMs to that. If you had to choose one or the other, which one would you do first? So that's really important. And what winds up happening is you get the stakeholders, especially in the situations where a team has multiple stakeholders, you get them to fight it out, right? So you have a stack, and the message I give my PMs is, when I have 4 different PMs who place requirements on my team, right? The message I give them all is, guys, I'm happy to work and I'm happy for my team to work on whatever is the most important thing is. You tell me what it is and we'll work on it, right? No problem. And then they need to go and correlate together about what is the most important thing. So if one PM says that mine is stack rank 1, the others can say, no, mine is stack rank 1. And then they can have that conversation. And I can gleefully stand off to the side and watch them fight it out. I don't have to get involved, right? You have no idea how many SDMs in Amazon have their hair on fire because they're trying to mediate between different stakeholders and trying to get all their needs met. I don't have that problem, right? I just stand aside and let them fight it out. It's awesome. And then the last thing is you semaphore the deliverables. So what I mean by that is, so that screenshot that you see here, the green, yellow, and red, is essentially a screenshot from my team's actual board. That's why it's blurred. But you can see there are several stories here that are color-coded green, several yellow, and like 1 red. And what that basically means is, if I look 3 months ahead, the green ones are the ones I feel confident in delivering, like within these next 3 months. The yellow ones, I think I should be able to deliver if the green ones don't wind up being extra complicated or if nothing changes, so on. And then the red ones are the ones that I probably will not deliver unless some miracle happens and like these other ones become much easier, like simpler than I expect. And what this allows the PMs to do is to say, that red one, we actually really need that within the next 3 months. So then I say, okay, great. Tell me which one you want to take out from the list above it, right? Which one you want to prioritize. Reprioritize it, and that red one will move into yellow or maybe into green, right? So that's a really good way to communicate as a team what you're planning to deliver and your confidence level on being able to deliver it. Next thing is around Kanban over Scrum, right? So I believe that Kanban is basically Scrum without the bullshit, right? The Scrum has a whole lot of ceremonies to it that, for example, planning poker and the sprint meeting, the sprint planning meeting, and like sometimes there is a PM directional meeting for the sprint, right? Like there's a lot of ceremonies, and on the teams where I've done Scrum, sometimes a 2-week sprint will mean 1 day's worth of sprint planning activities. That's a day you're never going to get back in your life, right? So Kanban doesn't have this. And it works really well with stack ranking because basically in Kanban, at any given time, you're working on the most important thing. You're done with that thing, you go to the next most important thing. The other interesting thing about Kanban versus Scrum is that Kanban optimizes for throughput. In other words, trying to get an item across the board as quickly as possible. Whereas Scrum utilizes or optimizes for resource utilization, which is making sure everybody is busy. So it's a really interesting distinction because basically what that means is in Kanban, you might have somebody who is not busy, right? Or who just jumps in to help out with some other story, if that means that they'll get that story to move faster, right? Whereas in a sprint, you always make sure somebody has a story that they're working on and blah, blah, blah. So I find Kanban to be much lighter weight and much more efficient than Scrum. Next part of the process is thin slicing and swarming, right? So this is a process that I've been doing probably for the last 10 years or so, where essentially a story is sliced into 8-hour chunks. And even analysis tasks, right? Like we're trying to come up with a design doc or whatever, like those are sliced into smaller chunks as well. So you slice stories into these small chunks and then you swarm on those thin slices. So the thin slices allow multiple developers to work on the same story at the same time. And the huge benefit of that is you avoid silos. Like when I first came into IMDb and into the team, like one of the things that I consistently heard from the devs is like, hey, we all have our own story. And like when it comes time for stand-up, I don't care what the other people are doing because it's not connected at all to what I'm doing. And I just feel isolated and I just have to keep plugging away on my story. That's super demotivating for devs. So the change that this allows is now you have 2, 3, 4, 5 devs all working on the same thing. And now when they're talking about things in stand-up, like the majority of the team is interested because they're working on that same thing. And that item also moves across the board much faster because now there are multiple people all swarming on the same thing. In terms of measurement and getting the team to measure their efficiency, Kanban has this concept called cycle time, right? Which is basically the amount of time it takes from a item to move from in progress to done, right? It combines really well with thin slicing because guess what? If every one of your tasks is 8 hours, your cycle time should be 8 hours. So if your cycle time is larger than that, there's a problem. So you can have a conversation about why are things taking longer than expected? What are the headwinds that we are facing? Is there anything we can do to fix them, et cetera, et cetera. And then in my team, I have biweekly team meetings. And in the beginning of every team meeting, I show them what the current last 2 weeks cycle time has been, what the standard deviation has been. And we talk about if we've gotten worse over time or better. We talk about what's driven that. Is there anything we want to change to make it better? It's a really powerful technique. Because what you can measure, you can optimize. And if you optimize cycle time, what you're doing is you're increasing throughput. In other words, your team is now more efficient. The next thing is retros, right? So retros are a Scrum technique, but they're also used in Kanban. They're super, super important, right? So we do retrospectives every 2 weeks. You want to keep them interesting. What I find is if you always do the old boring, what went well, what didn't go well, what did you want to do differently? Like you do that for a couple months and people just fall asleep. And all of a sudden your retros are, what went well? I don't know, like we delivered stuff. What went badly? There were some bugs. What do you want to do differently? Oh, nothing. Bye. That's not a great retro. So you want to change it up over time, like there are a lot of different retrospective methods and they can be super, super effective and make things more interesting for the team. And finally, if you do come up with action items, you want to make sure those action items are being done. So you're tracking them, right? Like at the next retro, you talk about those action items we agreed on the last retro. How is that going? You have specific owners assigned and you track those action items with the owners. When the team sees that they have a voice into how the team operates, and that voice is actually listened to, that's when they start engaging, right? That's when they start actually thinking, actually, what could be improved? And that's how you get to a high performance team. It's a team not driven by the manager, but driven by the team members themselves. That's how it becomes high performance. So let's talk about individual attributes. What individual attributes should we encourage and how do we do it? The first one, I think, and the most important by far is ownership, right? So I'll talk about this a little bit later, but basically ownership is the concept of when a developer works on something, they understand the business implications of what they're doing. They're not simply performing a task, but they're solving a business problem. They own the business problem they're implementing, right? If your team doesn't do, this is a time to go and have that conversation, right? This thing I'm doing, why am I doing it? I used to work in HoloLens in Microsoft, and our VP had this set of 3 questions that he told everybody to ask. The questions were: 1, what is the most important thing that I should be doing? 2, am I doing that thing? 3, if not, why not? And there could be a good reason for why not. But the point is to understand that reason, right? And if you keep asking those questions, like, you get to this concept of ownership, right? Where you own the work that you're doing, not simply are executing it. The next thing is around engagement, right? So obviously, if you're constantly doing busy work, if you're constantly doing things that are not interesting, or your team members are doing things that are not interesting, they're going to get disengaged. They're going to stop putting in 100%. They're going to stop really thinking about the business problem. So it's really important to explain again, like, the context about why they're doing what they're doing, and to make sure that the work that they're doing varies, allows them room for growth, and allows them the opportunity to explore, expand their scope, go on the edge. Like, I tell my directs that I always want them to be uncomfortable, but not in pain. So in other words, have just enough pressure and work on them to feel like they're stretching, but not enough so that they're losing sleep over it, right? So that's the balance that you want to try to strike, and that then generates engagement. Next thing is growth, right? As a manager, I see it as one of my main jobs to make sure that the path to the next level is very clear for each one of my directs. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specific tools for this. But then what I tell them is, look, my job is to make sure you know how to get to the next level. How quickly or slowly you want to do it, that's up to you. Like, you can go slower if you want to, you can go faster. I'm going to try to gently nudge you along this path, but it's never going to be like a drag by a collar, by the scruff of your neck type situation, right? So, regular feedback is super important to make that happen. And then finally, like, there has to be time, and we'll talk about specific techniques for that, in their day to be able to focus specifically on growth. And we'll talk about how to do that. So how do we do that? What are the tools that we can use? The first one goes back to ownership, right? And this one is a mantra that I keep repeating to all of my directs. Think like a CEO. If you were the CEO of IMDb, what would you be doing right now, right? What would you think is the most important thing to do, and why? And what that does is, when there is a prioritization conversation that happens, and we do these prioritization conversations publicly with PMs, it's more likely, and I have seen my devs jump in and say, hold on, what's the revenue impact of this thing you're proposing? And how does that align to the revenue impact of the other thing that you're thinking about doing? Which one of them should be more important, right? What user scenario are we trying to address? And how many customers is that going to affect? Is that enough customers for us to want to prioritize it versus the cost that it's going to incur to develop this feature, right? So that's basically the mentality. Like, you want every person in the company to be the CEO of the company, or to think like a CEO of the company, and be able to engage in those business value conversations. That then creates engagement. That creates a feeling like they have a skin in the game, as opposed to they're just basically executing tasks. Next one, and 5 points for anybody who knows why the mountain is pink. I will explain it in a second. I had to generate this image with Gen AI because there were no pictures of pink mountains. But I'll tell you. So this is from Douglas Adams, A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, if anybody has read it. He has this story, which I found really apt for workplace environments, which is that there was a magician who made a bet that he was going to remove a mountain overnight, or to hide a mountain overnight. And during the night, he tried all kinds of different tricks and nothing worked. Finally, towards morning, he hired an excavation company to just excavate the damn thing and throw it into space. Unfortunately, he lost the bet because somebody noticed the new moon orbiting the planet. And so Douglas Adams basically says that all he had to do was paint the mountain pink. And then people would have walked right over it without realizing it was there, because it would have become somebody else's problem, right? And that idea of somebody else's problems, I think, is extremely important in workplace settings, right? So what do I mean by that? Day to day, as employees of a company or as managers, we consistently encounter problems that nobody else wants to touch, right? In other words, somebody else's problems. For example, your documentation is not as good as it should be, or the build system keeps breaking, or like your tests are flaky, or a myriad different things like communication problems with a different team or something else, right? There are problems that nobody wants to touch. And what I found, and I actually I've sat in on Microsoft talent review meetings where we've been discussing people and how they approach their work. And I remember one SDM who has since went on to become a director at Amazon mentioning that, yeah, I have this guy who exposed like 25 different somebody else's problems. He drove 3 of them over the course of the year, but he exposed 25. And this guy got like absolute top marks you can get. Why? Because generally somebody else's problems also have a lot of business value. And when they go unsolved, the whole organization is suffering. So people who can go and actually identify these somebody else's problems and start exposing them become super, super valuable. Of all the career growth and sort of rock star tips that I can give ICs, this is the biggest one, absolute biggest one. If you can find somebody else's problems and expose them and drive them, you will be invaluable to the company. And then as a manager, it's super important for us that when we notice people doing this, we are actually celebrating that, right? Like we are giving them public credit. We're giving them the visibility, like all that stuff. It's super, super valuable when people do this. Next thing is problems, not tasks, right? So I have this notion, and I've been purposefully avoiding mentioning this up till now, of a task monkey. So a task monkey is somebody who basically continuously takes tasks, finishes the tasks, which is great, right? But then goes on to say, okay, what's the next thing I should do? And then what's the next thing I should do? And then what's the next thing I should do? And the problem with that mentality is you don't have any ownership. You don't have any agency into what you're doing. You're just constantly given tasks to do. The problem with task monkeyism is sooner or later, and this might be in 1 year, and 3 years, and 5 years, task monkeys will be replaced by AI, right? AI is already really good. And in 5 years, you should be able to give AI tasks that currently task monkeys are doing and have AI execute on those tasks, right? So the end of life for task monkeys is very close. So it's much better to focus on business problems, right? And understand the business context of what you're doing and make decisions based on that business context, which is not something AI is going to be able to do as easily than to simply narrow down and just think about tasks. So as managers, we want to encourage people to tackle problems, not tasks, right? Not to be task monkeys. Next one is around story ownership, right? So this is a specific technique that I use on my team where basically not everybody can own the whole team and not everybody can actually be the CEO of IMDb, right? Going back to think like a CEO. But what I do and what we do on the team is as we have stories that are coming into our backlog, we assign a story owner, right? And the story owner's responsibility is to they're the CEO of that story. Their responsibility is to understand the full business context, work with PM, understand all the requirements, do the design for that story, do the thin slicing for that story, and then drive that story through execution. So what that might mean is they will help assign tasks to developers that are swarming on the story, to other developers. They might make adjustments to the story if adjustments are needed, and so on and so forth. So they're basically making sure that the story is appropriately saturated so that it's being worked on and getting through to the end. What happens at the end of the year in performance reviews is we talk about people's performance as story owners, right? They've driven story A, B, C to conclusion. And that is the way that they're basically evaluated. Next tool that I use, and this is something that I use on my team, is what I call the career tracking spreadsheet. So most large companies, and some of the smaller ones as well, have very clearly defined expectations for moving to the next level or expectations for each level of their career ladder, right? And so what I basically did is I created a spreadsheet, and this is an actual screenshot of a spreadsheet for one of my team members that on the left, you can see it's listing out. So this is basically directly from Amazon's expectations for the level, right? So it's listing out the categories, it's listing out the specific expectations. And then we go through together with the direct and we make an evaluation of here is my evaluation, here is their self-evaluation of whether they're meeting or exceeding, or they might have an opportunity gap, right? Which basically means like they might have the skill, but they haven't had the opportunity to show it. Or they might have a weakness area, like a growth area. So we go through and we identify specific areas where they need to grow to get to the next level. And then our conversations are basically specifically around those things, like how can we plug those growth areas? And at least on my team, like everybody has found that to be super valuable, that approach. Next thing is actually one I stole from a Medium article. It was called The Art of the Awkward One-on-Ones. So the basic idea here is if you're going to spend 30 minutes in a one-on-one with somebody, you probably don't want to be talking to them about things that you could have talked about in public, right? You want to talk about the awkward things that you don't want other people to hear. And so I sent that article to every one of my directs when I first schedule the one-on-ones. And I really try to encourage them to focus on the awkward. And what that would be is transparency. If anything has gone wrong, things where they need more visibility on, or things where they feel like they've gotten the visibility they wanted, their career growth, their personal lives. What we don't talk about is what they did over the last couple of days or whatever, over the last week, because that I can get from stand-ups, that I can get in public conversations. So we don't talk about those things in one-on-ones. Next technique that I use is called the above level bucket. And this is a technique I actually stole from my wife's manager in Microsoft. Basically, what he's done is he separates his time into 3 buckets: below level, at level, above level. So below level is basically things that like answering emails, going to meetings, things like that, things that he just has to do, Slack messages, so on. At level are the main things that you're expected to do, right? The main expectations for your level, for your job. The above level is the interesting one. Those are things that he is not expected to do. And the key part of this above level bucket technique is you block time for the above level work. So he literally will take a block out of his calendar and he will mark it as above level work. And during that time, he will only focus on things that he is not expected to be doing. That's a great time, by the way, to look at somebody else's problems. And so what I tell my directs is, hey, take anywhere from 5 to 20% of your week, depending on how busy we are otherwise, and block it off for above level. That can be like half an hour a day. It can be like 4 hours on Friday. It could even be 8 hours on Friday, depending on how busy we are. So the week to week, the amount might change, but overall, like the target is somewhere between 5 and 10%. Next one is a time management technique that we use called planned Pomodoros. If you guys don't know what a Pomodoro is, briefly, you separate your time into 25-minute on, 5-minute off chunks. During the 25-minute on, you focus on one thing and one thing only. This is a great thing for folks who are procrastinating, right? Because you can tell yourself, hey, I only have to work on this for 25 minutes and then I'll be done, right? Then I can go do something else. And what I found when I procrastinate and I do this, 25 minutes passes and I just keep going because like I'm engaged, I'm interested. I don't have to stop in 25 minutes. But the key thing here is your first Pomodoro of the day when you come in, you look at how many meetings you have, how many other commitments you have, and you say, okay, today I'm going to be able to get done like 4 Pomodoros or whatever, 5 Pomodoros. That's 2 hours, 2.5 hours of actual time. What do I want to do during those Pomodoro periods? And you actually plan out like this Pomodoro, I will do X, that Pomodoro, I will do Y, or I'll spend 2 Pomodoros on this design document. I'll spend 1 Pomodoro on the implementation of this task I'm supposed to work on. I'll spend 1 Pomodoro on driving the story, right? And then you just basically execute. What I found when doing that is my productivity was like way, way higher than it is when I don't do Pomodoros in this way. So that's basically the IC suggestions. The next thing I want to talk about really quick is the manager mindset, right? So what mindset has been helpful leading to these attributes for me? The first one and the biggest one is transparency. So one of the core things that I do that HR probably would slap me on the wrist for is I'm usually very explicit with directs about what happens in talent review meetings, for example, right? Like how is their performance score actually calculated, and like how do these conversations happen? I don't talk to them about things that might cause conflicts. Like I'm not going to say, Bob said that you did this or whatever, and so you're not as good as a developer, because then Bob is going to hear some angry messages. So I don't talk about that, but I do talk about like general feedback and how the process works and all of that. HR is generally very much against this, right? And I've had to do a lot of talking with my manager to convince him to let me do it. But ultimately, like I've never had this backfire. And in the same way, we are transparent about things that's coming down the pipeline. For example, we never say things like, there is a change coming down the pipeline, but I can't talk about it yet. Like when we find out something, we talk about it. Our in-progress business plan drafts, for example, are accessible by all of our team members, right? We don't hoard information to make ourselves appear more important or necessary. And when I say we, by the way, what I'm talking about is the entire IMDb organization. This is a value that the whole organization is aligned on. And that really helps in terms of driving employee engagement, in terms of think like a CEO on like all of those things. Next thing is delegation, right? So being able to delegate effectively, especially as a manager, is super, super important. And I think about there are 4 different types of delegation. Delegating for scale, which is basically, oh my God, I don't have enough time to do this. So here, you go do it. Delegating for visibility. Hey, I could do this, but you could use the visibility for this. So why don't you do it? Delegating for weakness, which is, I know I'm not good at this, but you are much better. So it might make more sense for you to do it. Or delegating for growth, right? Which is, I am good at this, but I know this is an area where you're growing and I can help you grow. So you take it and I'll help you be successful at it, right? So being able to delegate and figuring out which type of delegation you're involved in is going to be very helpful to be able to drive the team. The next thing here is this theory I have that basically all you do is falling on a triangle where the vertices are impact, effort, and visibility, right? And the point is that if your work aggregates at any one of those vertices, that's a problem, right? So for example, the people who always optimize for impact and don't think about like effort and visibility are generally the heroes. And heroes in a bad sense, because a hero allows the organization to not solve its systemic problems, right? So you don't want heroes in an organization. People who optimize for effort always and don't think about impact or visibility are the workhorses. So those are the people who are going to stay till 11 p.m. trying to unblock that build, whether that's important or not, or trying to fix that really minor bug just because like it's bugging them. And again, like it's not a bad thing. The problem is that over time, if that's all you do, you're going to get burned out. And then guess what we call the people who optimize for visibility and don't think about effort and impact? That's right, assholes. We've all encountered those people in an organization. And in my experience, they're not usually liked. So don't do that. That's the cynical path of career development, like always optimizing for visibility, always making sure that your name is seen by the leadership chain. Don't do that. So as a manager, what we want to do is we want to make sure that ICs stay in the middle of this triangle, which means routing the work to them, which means making sure they're getting the visibility that they deserve, right? Making sure that they're not staying till 11 p.m., like working on inane things, right? So as managers, we use this triangle to make sure that their work is in balance. And that involves empathy, right? So that involves really listening to the people who are working for you, always assuming best intent in a conversation, right? So not assuming malice, and ultimately valuing people over projects. And the last thing that I would mention here is visibility, right? As a manager, and remember, this is a manager mindset section. As a manager, our job is to give credit when things go well and to own the blame when things don't, right? That's what a manager is supposed to do. Visibility is the last important thing. And then the last thing I would mention is creating great teams means hiring for success, right? Hiring the right talent. And here we generally very quickly run into trouble. Like traditional interviewing techniques like whiteboard and like system design interviews, etc., Like Healy will probably laugh because I've been doing a lot of system design and coding interviews in the Incredihire cohort. But I actually don't believe those techniques work really well in terms of actually predicting talent, right? New grads don't know how to represent themselves well, right? Like we had a new grad in our cohort and like he was an awesome guy. He did a lot of really great work, but get him in an interview setting and yeah, needs help. And this results in a lot of good people not being able to get hired. At the same time, if you think about like from a hiring manager perspective, when you post a job, you either get overwhelmed with like resumes that just don't really align or that are just not truthful. Or like in my case, I actually have a position open on my team, but I'm getting very few resumes because the applicant tracking system is actually just screening all of them out. I never even see them, right? In terms of you wind up having to do at a job, like the thing you don't wind up having to do at a job is write good resumes. It's a one-time skill in a sense, or it's a skill you only need when you're looking for a job. And so that creates a lot of churn, both on the hiring manager side and on the candidate side. So we, like at Incredihire, what we decided to do is try to put together a real world development program. And Healy, like I mentioned, was in this program, one of the attendants in today's webinar. So what we do is we form people into teams and we have them work on a real world project, right? During this work, and this all basically comes from like any manager will be able to tell you, any manager with some degree of experience, that when you work with somebody hands-on, you can usually tell whether they're a rock star or not within a period of a few weeks, right? 1, 2, 3 weeks tops. Like you already know if somebody is going to be awesome or maybe somebody is going to struggle a little bit more, right? So what we basically do is we have a 6-week program where we work with people hands-on for get tasks for about 20 hours a week. During this time, we evaluate how they're doing. We give them a lot of practical on-the-job training, right? So like specific things that we've learned from our time in Maine. And then ultimately, like if they graduate the program, we are able to send them along to our company partners who are then much more likely to go and want to interview them, right? Now, the reason we are better from a company perspective is one, we get like when we send a company our candidates, we've worked with them hands-on. We know how good they are. And we stand behind the fact that they can get into a company and do a great job. So it can save time for companies to just interview random folks when they can go in and get somebody with a performance evaluation written up with a history of artifacts that they worked on, like all that stuff. It reduces turnover risk, right? Like it reduces hiring people who are not necessarily as suitable and then having to go look for somebody else. We also provide these candidates 90 days mentoring, right? So basically, if you get hired at the conclusion of our program, or if you hire somebody coming out of one of our cohorts, we give them 90 days on the job coaching about how to ramp up faster, how to be more successful, and all that stuff. These are the 3 of us that are coaching and that are running these programs. As I mentioned, Ken and George and myself, we all have experience in a bunch of different MAANG type companies that we basically bring to bear. As our partners, basically there's no obligation, right? So we don't ask companies to guarantee interviews. We don't ask companies to guarantee hires. We don't ask companies to change their existing recruiting process. All we ask is, okay, when we send you our candidates, take a look. If they fit your role, it might make sense for you to interview them. And then if they decide to hire, their first hire is free. And then after that, we have competitive rates. So that's essentially it. That's the end of my talk. Feel free to go to incredihire.com if you're interested in participating in a cohort or if you're interested in talking to us about our graduates. Go to incredihire.com. All the contact information is there. We have a chatbot. Feel free to use the chatbot and hope to talk to you guys. Any questions, feel free to put in chat if there's anything that you have questions on anything I've covered. Otherwise, I hope that this was useful for everyone. Ken, anything that you want to add from your end that I may not have covered?
It was occurring to me that for everybody watching this, the achievement of a high performance team is a tremendous amount of work. There's a lot you're thinking of, a lot you're doing. There are behaviors, both from the IC side and from the manager side, that you learn, you correct, you iterate, you improve over time, or you see the results happening. And so you gravitate toward those things. If it were easy, there'd be no bad managers. That's all I'm saying there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a question here. What is the success rate of the last cohort? So in the last cohort, we had 7 SDEs and 6 SDETs. One of the SDEs dropped out because of time requirements. He wound up not being able to make as much time as he needed. Out of the 6 remaining SDEs, 4 of them graduated, 2 of them did not. From SDETs, there were 6 SDETs, as I mentioned. 3 of them graduated, 3 of them did not. Any other questions? How do we assess graduation? Sure, thanks. So basically, we assess based on 4 main criteria. It's an acronym that I call OCA, which basically O stands for ownership, right? We've talked about ownership and why that's really important. Competence, right? Which is basically, are you good at your main job expectations, right? Next one is collaboration, which is basically how well do you work with others? How well do you learn from others? How well do you jump in to help others? And the last one is attitude, right? Which is essentially what kind of energy do you bring to the team? How much passion for learning and passion for technology do you have? Passion for technology is actually one of Microsoft's competencies that Microsoft specifically tests for in interviews, right? How much of that do you bring to the team? And we basically grade people on those 4 attributes. And basically, in order to graduate, the ultimate criteria is if we had an open spot on our team, would we hire this person? That's the criteria. Really good question. I touched on making the retro interesting. What are some of the different ideas? So there are a lot of different retrospective formats. So for example, there is a ship format, sailboat format, which is basically like you draw a picture of a sailboat and you say, okay, what is the wind in our sails? What are the things that are helping us move faster? What is the drag on our heel? What are the things that are making us move slower than we need to do? Like, what are the waves? What is happening in the overall like company organization that might make our chopping or that might make our execution a little bit more difficult? So that's one format. It could also be really minor things. And by the way, like if you Google for retrospective formats, there are websites dedicated to it. There's a site with, I think, 15 or 20 different possible retrospective formats you can run. One thing we do in IMDb, because this is IMDb, is like we typically do what like kudos, like we talk about, like we start with kudos to these people for doing whatever. Then what went great, or the good, we call it, the bad, the ugly, and action items. Or another format can be like mad, sad, glad. But the point is what we do in IMDb is every one of our sprints is named after a movie, right? So at the end of each retrospective, we choose a movie and then we modify it in some funny way, modify the wording, and that's the name of the sprint. And at the retrospective, at the end of that sprint, the good, bad, ugly, like those categories, they each get a screenshot from the movie. So it's just this one little tiny funny thing that we do just to make it a little bit more interesting. So that's that one. Now, in terms of how often the assessments are. So what we do, or what we have done in the first cohort, and we might change this up a little bit, but basically we've been doing regular, like weekly 30-minute one-on-ones with everybody on the team. We might change this to office hours in the next cohort. But basically during that time, we would be able to tell people how they're doing, right? So in the first cohort, the way that this happened is for example, for SDEs that were not graduating, second week, we were already giving them messages that, hey, there are some potential issues here. Probably here are some growth areas to focus on. In the third week, those messages got more frenetic. Hey, like, it looks like if things continue the way they're currently continuing, you may not graduate, right? By the time you get to week 5, it was going to be like, you're not going to graduate. Here are the reasons, right? And here are the things that that you need to focus on. So by week 6, when they didn't graduate, like they already knew, right? So it doesn't come as a surprise. It doesn't happen at the end. Any other questions? And the thing that I would encourage you guys to do, if you're interested in potentially like finding out more about the cohort, our next cohort starts October 28th. Feel free to submit an application. It doesn't cost anything. You can schedule a 30-minute sort of discovery meeting with one of us. Again, completely free. You can ask whatever questions you want to ask. You can decide if the program is right for you. There's no pressure, no obligation. If you decide that you want to do it, then we'll talk about next steps. If you don't, no worries. Cool. Thank you everybody for attending today. I hope that the talk was useful for you all. And Ken, thank you for joining. So you will see the recording of this on YouTube. We will upload it there. This was also live streamed on LinkedIn and Facebook. So you should be able to find this on LinkedIn if you look up my profile. In the future, we'll have the YouTube session listed in the very beginning. All right. Thank you all.
Another webinar next week.
Yes, we do have another webinar. Yeah, thank you for reminding me. Yes, YouTube channel is Incredihire. Thank you for reminding me. So we do have another webinar next week. That one will be focused specifically on behavioral interviews. So we'll talk about how to pass behavioral interviewing. And we'll also do mock interviews with folks. So you can jump on. We'll actually ask you a behavioral interview question. You can respond and we'll give you feedback on your response. So folks in the past have found that to be pretty useful. So that's going to be next Wednesday at 12 p.m. at lunch. Feel free to go to incredihire.com. You should see all of our upcoming webinars there. Just register. And then, yeah, hope to see you in the next one. Cool. Thanks all.